The dark reason Gandalf can't remember the blue wizards. There is a moment in the legendarium so quietly placed that most readers walk straight past it without breaking stride. It is not in the heat of Moria or the fires above Ziraxigil. It is in a letter, a private letter written by Tolkien in 1958 to a reader who had asked a simple question about the blue wizards. And in that letter, Tolkien does something extraordinary. He admits that he does not know what happened to them, not as a writer confessing an unfinished subplot, but as a chronicler confessing a gap so large that the whole shape of the Third Age bends around it. He writes that they went into the East, and that he never had any clear story of what became of them there. And then, almost in passing, he adds the sentence that should have changed every conversation about the War of the Ring that anyone has ever had. He says they may have had a lot to do with the way the world went. Think about that. Two Maiar, two divine spirits clothed in mortal flesh, walking east while Gandalf walked west. And the man who built this entire world says he never had a clear story for them. But here is the real question. The one this video is going to follow all the way down, through the Ainulindal and the Valaquenta, and the letters, and the deep architecture of Tolkien's cosmology, until we find what is actually at the bottom of it. Did Gandalf stay silent about the blue wizards because he truly could not remember, or because he remembered exactly and chose mercy over truth? This is not speculation pulled from nowhere. This is what the text actually says when you follow it all the way down, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Let us begin where the story actually begins. Not in the Shire, not in Rivendell, in Valinor, before the sun was made, before the first tree burned, in the halls where the Ainur sang the world into being. The Ainulindale is not just a creation myth. It is a document about the nature of power and its relationship to form. Tolkien establishes something foundational there, something that governs every Maiar who will ever set foot in Middle-earth, and it is this. Every time a spirit of the Ainur pours itself into physical matter, it is changed by that matter. It gives something of itself to the world, and cannot take it back whole. Melkor himself, the greatest of the Ainur, was diminished each time he descended into flesh and stone and darkness. He scattered his power into the things he made and could not fully recall it. The process of incarnation is not costumary. It is not a suit you wear and remove. It is a genuine narrowing of a divine nature into a body built for grief and weather and hunger and loss. Now hold that against the Astari. The chapter on the Astari in Unfinished Tales tells us exactly what the Valar intended when they sent the 5 wizards to Middle-earth. They were not sent as generals. They were not sent to overpower Sauron with divine force. They were sent clothed in mortal bodies, speaking with mortal voices, bound by mortal limitations, and this was deliberate. The Valar had already tried the other way. The direct intervention, the war at the end of the First Age, had broken Beleriand and drowned Númenor. The lesson had been bought at continental cost. This time, the Maiar would go as advisors, as kindlers of courage, as figures who could work alongside men and elves without crushing their agency beneath divine weight. And to enforce this, Tolkien tells us in Unfinished Tales, they would be subject to forgetting, they would be hindered. Their divine memory, their full access to what they were before the world was made, would be veiled behind the limitation of flesh. Forgetting was not a flaw in the design, it was the design. Pay attention to this next part, because this is where everything about Gandalf's silence begins to take shape. If the Astari were built to forget, then Gandalf's vagueness about the blue wizards is not a personal failure. It is not indifference. It is not ignorance born from distance. It may be the exact mechanism the Valar installed to make him functional in his mission. A Maiar who remembers, with full divine clarity, the fate of 2 colleagues who walked east and did not return, who built cults instead of resistance movements, who became in their long centuries of flesh something the Valar could not speak of without grief, would carry that knowledge into every conversation he ever had with a frightened hobbit or an uncertain king, and that knowledge would crush him. It would make him useless to the very purpose he was sent to serve. So the silence holds. Not because Gandalf never knew LOTR and Palando in Valinor. He did know them. They were Maiar together, before the world had walls. But because the body he was given in Middle-earth was not designed to bear the full weight of what they became. Picture this: Valinor, before the mission is decided. The halls of Manwë on Taniquetil, and below them, the wide lands of Aman, where the Maiar move like light between the trees. 5 are being chosen. 5 out of all the host of the Ainur who serve the Valar in those blessed lands. And among those chosen, 2 are selected by Orome and Manwë for a commission that separates them entirely from the others. They will not go west to west. They will go east to east, into the vast territories that no elf from Valinor has ever truly mapped, into the lands where Sauron's shadow has been longest and his corruptions deepest. 2 Maiar who stand there in the light of Aman, knowing what the commission means, knowing the Ainulindal's law that flesh changes those who wear it, knowing that the East is not Rivendell and the prancing pony, but something wilder and older and far less friendly to divine memory. They accept anyway. And Gandalf watches them go east while he turns west, and does not know, cannot know, that the next time he hears anything about the road they are walking, it will be in a letter from the Valar that arrives like a stone dropped in still water, saying only, "They went, and we do not have a clear story of what became of them there." Now, here is what the appendices and unfinished tales actually confirm about the Blue Wizard's arrival, and it is a detail so staggering that I want to make sure it lands properly. They arrived before Gandalf and Saruman, not by a century, not by 2 centuries, by an entire age. The Blue Wizards came to Middle-earth during the Second Age, while Sauron was still at the height of his power, while the forging of the Rings of Power was either happening or had just happened, while Númenor still stood, while Celebrimbor was still alive or had only just fallen. They arrived at the moment of maximum danger, when Sauron was not yet defeated, when the shadow had not yet taken its first great wound at the last alliance, and they went east into the vast territories that Sauron had been cultivating for millennia, and they began their work. That is not a minor detail. That changes the entire shape of the story. Because here is what that means for Gandalf. When the Grey Wizard arrived in Middle-earth, roughly in the year 1000 of the Third Age, the Blue Wizards had already been in Middle-earth for perhaps 2000 years. They had been walking the east while the War of the Last Alliance was fought and won. They had been walking the east while Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's hand. They had been walking the east while the ring lay lost in the Gladden Fields for centuries. They had been walking the east while Sméagol found it. They had been walking the east for 2 entire ages of the world, and Gandalf stepped ashore in Middle-earth, knowing that somewhere to the east, 2 of his kin from Valinor were engaged in a mission he could not see, in a territory he could not reach, against a shadow whose full extent he was only beginning to understand. Now think about what that actually means. Gandalf is not the oldest wizard. He is not the most experienced wizard by any measure of time in the field. The Blue Wizards had been incarnate, had been subject to all the limitations and erosions of mortal flesh, for 2000 years before Gandalf ever felt his first cold morning in Middle-earth. 2000 years of hunger and weather, and the slow narrowing of divine memory that Tolkien described. 2000 years of choosing, every single day, whether to remember what they were, or to become what the body was making of them. And Saruman arrived first of the 5, in the year 1000, and then Gandalf, and then Radagast. But the Blue Wizards were already ancient in their mission by the time any of them stepped off whatever ship brought the Astray west to east. Already ancient. Already shaped by their long exposure to exactly the kind of territory that shapes you, that bends you, that offers you not corruption but something more seductive than corruption, belonging. Because here is what nobody asks about the Blue Wizards' mission. Not what they were sent to do, which is well documented in unfinished tales, but what it would have felt like to do it. They were sent to stir up resistance to Sauron among the peoples of the East, not to command them, not to rule them, to move among them, to kindle courage, to build networks of opposition in territories that Sauron had been cultivating and corrupting for the entirety of the Second Age. To go into communities that knew Sauron's name as a god's name, that had been taught to worship him through Númenórean intermediaries, that had been folded into his cult by centuries of patient missionary work, and to whisper against all of that. As two old men with walking sticks and a veil of flesh over whatever they had been in Valinor for 2,000 years. Picture this: a village somewhere in the east of Rhûn, east of any name on the map that Tolkien ever drew. The village has rites. The rites are old. They were not always what they are now, but they have become something specific, and the thing they honor has a name in the old tongue that translates roughly as Lord of Gifts. The Blue Wizards arrive. They are known. Perhaps they have been known in this region for decades, for centuries, under different names given by different generations. They teach differently. They speak of the shadow in the West, and of the West's need for allies here in the East. And some people listen, and some people do not. And the ones who do not, who belong to the old rites, who have been inside the cult of the Lord of Gifts so long that it is the architecture of their meaning, look at these two old men with their strange authority and their stranger names, and they see not teachers but threats. What happens to two Maiar in that position, over centuries, over the slow erosion of divine memory that Tolkien confirmed is built into the Astari's incarnation? Letter 211 gives us the answer, Tolkien's answer. The answer that should end the conversation about whether the Blue Wizards were minor figures, footnotes, peripheral to the real story. They may have founded magical traditions and cults, Tolkien writes, that went astray. Went astray. That is the phrase. Not were corrupted by Sauron, not were destroyed, went astray, which means they began as something Orome and Manwë intended, and became something those same Valar could not have predicted, or perhaps could not have prevented, given the law of incarnation that changes whatever enters flesh. And once you read that phrase against everything the Ainulindal establishes about what happens to divine spirits in mortal bodies, the Blue Wizards stop being mysteries. They become warnings, the most important warnings in the entire legendarium, because they are warnings that Tolkien never quite finished writing, and the incompleteness is itself part of the terror. Here is where it gets strange, really strange, because Tolkien gives us another set of names for the Blue Wizards in the late essay collected in Peoples of Middle-earth, and those names are not casual labels. In Tolkien's legendarium, names given by the Valar are prophecy. They are mission statements. They are what a being is intended to become. Morinitar, Darkness Slayer, Romestamo, East Helper. Say those names again. Feel the weight of them. Darkness Slayer and East Helper. These are not the names of peripheral figures. These are names that carry the full force of divine intention. Names that would have been chosen in those halls of Aman before the mission was given. Names that describe what Manwë and Orome believed these two Maiar would accomplish in the vast territories east of every map the elves ever made. And then, set those names alongside what Letter 211 says actually happened. The distance between Darkness Slayer and founded cults that went astray. The distance between East Helper and we never had a clear story of what became of them. That distance is not a footnote. That distance is one of the most devastating gaps in all of Tolkien's writing, and it is devastating precisely because it is so quiet. There is no dramatic fall, no moment of temptation at Mount Doom, no council scene where a wizard declares his allegiance to the shadow. Just a silence that grows longer and wider across the centuries, a silence in which two Maiar with heroic names walk east and east and east until the names no longer fit, or fit differently than anyone intended. Now think about Gandalf knowing this. not knowing it consciously, not holding it as a clear narrative with a beginning and middle and end, because the veil of flesh and the Astari's designed limitation would prevent that kind of direct divine recall. But knowing it the way you know something that happened to someone you loved and cannot stop thinking about, even when you cannot name the thought. The way grief sits in the body without necessarily surfacing as a particular memory. Gandalf arrived in Middle-earth 1,000 years into the Third Age, 2 full ages behind his colleagues in the East, walking his western mission among hobbits and dwarves and men of Rohan and Gondor, carrying inside him, in whatever remains of his Maya nature under the veil of flesh, the faintest echo of what he knew in Valinor about LOTR and Palando, the echo of 2 spirits choosing the Eastern Commission with something that looked like courage and felt, perhaps, like certainty. The echo of the Valar watching them go and not knowing any more clearly than we do what would happen when divine memory met 2,000 years of flesh in the east of the world. And every time someone asks Gandalf about the other wizards, that echo stirs. He says they went into the east. He says he does not know what became of them. He says, in Unfinished Tales, that he fears they failed and abandoned their mission, or perhaps never fully understood it. Now ask yourself whether that is ignorance, or something far more careful than ignorance. Because here is the thing about Gandalf that the entire arc of his story in Middle-earth reveals, if you look at it from the right angle. He is not a figure who speaks carelessly. He is not a figure who admits uncertainty, unless uncertainty is itself the only honest answer. When he does not know something, he says so with the precision of someone who knows exactly where the edge of his knowledge falls, and why it falls there. And when he knows something he chooses not to say, he says it sideways, or he does not say it at all, or he wraps it in a question that leaves the weight with the person asking. His silence about the blue wizards is Gandalfian silence. It has the shape of deliberate mercy, the shape of a truth held back, not because the holder is ashamed of it, but because the full weight of it, delivered directly, would break something that needs to remain unbroken. Picture this. Frodo, in the weeks before he leaves the Shire for good, sitting with Gandalf in the garden at Bag End. He asks, the way Frodo asks things, with the particular innocence that is actually a form of profound courage, about the other wizards, the ones he has never met. Gandalf says, "There were 5 of us." He says, "Saruman, you will meet in time, though I hope on better terms than you are destined to." He says, "Radagast, who loves birds and grows strange over the years." He says, "And 2 others, who went east, into the great territories beyond Rhûn, and of whom I can tell you little." Frodo asks, "Are they still there?" Gandalf is quiet for a moment that feels longer than it is. And then he says, "I do not know." That is not an admission of ignorance. That is the most precise thing Gandalf can say, because the truth behind it, the full truth, is this. He does not know whether they are still there as what they were meant to be. He does not know whether the thing walking the east under those names is still Morinitar and Romestamo, or whether 2,000 years of flesh have made it something else. And not knowing that, not having the certainty that would allow him to say yes, they are there, and they are what we sent them to be, is not the same as not knowing where they are geographically. It is not knowing whether to mourn them, and that is the question Gandalf cannot answer. Not for Frodo, not for Saruman, in whatever conversations they had in their long years in Middle-earth. Not for himself, in whatever passes for the interior life of a Maya wearing mortal skin. The question of whether LOTR and Palando are still the Darkness Slayer and the East Helper, or whether they have become something the names were never meant to describe. Now we need to go deeper into what Tolkien's cosmological laws actually say about this kind of falling. Not Saruman's fall, which is dramatic and documented and shaped by pride and a desire for power that runs through every conversation he ever has. The blue wizard's fall, if it is a fall, would look nothing like Saruman's. And understanding why requires understanding what Tolkien means by going astray. The Ainulindal is very clear about the nature of evil in Arda. Evil is not a force. Evil is a corruption of good, a turning of things from their intended purpose, a using of real powers for ends that twist away from the music. Morgoth was the first and greatest example. He did not create a new darkness. He took the light of Ilúvatar's intent and bent it, scattered his own divine nature into things that were real and good, and turned them toward ruin. And this is the pattern. Evil in Tolkien's world is always parasitic. It cannot make. It can only unmake, or bend, or corrupt. Now apply that law to the blue wizards. They were not sent east to become evil. They were sent to become helpers, to build resistance, to kindle courage in peoples that Sauron had been cultivating for an age. But what if the building of resistance, in the conditions of the East, required the blue wizards to work with the materials available? Not with established councils of elves and rings of power and the deep traditions of Noldorin lore that Gandalf could draw on in the West. With existing traditions, existing cults, existing structures of meaning and power that had been there before Sauron arrived, and that Sauron had already, partially, bent toward his own purposes. What if the blue wizards, in the practical necessity of their mission, had to work inside those traditions, to take the magical practices they found in the East and redirect them, give them new purposes, point them away from the Lord of Gifts and towards something that looked more like resistance? That would be legitimate. That would be exactly what the Valar sent them to do, in the most pragmatic sense. You do not build resistance movements among people who know nothing of divine power by arriving and saying, "Forget everything you know, here is a new truth." You build them by finding what is already real and already strong in the people you are working with, and you try to point that reality and that strength towards something better. But pointing something towards something better is not the same as transforming it. The thing keeps its shape, the cult keeps its rights. And over centuries, over 2,000 years of the slow erosion of divine memory in mortal flesh, the Maya who arrived saying, "I will redirect these practices," begins to blur into the practices themselves. Not because he chose corruption, but because the limitation built into his very body made it impossible to maintain the pure distinction, year after year, century after century, between the helper who uses the tradition and the tradition that has absorbed the helper. This is going astray, not treachery, not an oath of Fëanor, not a ring worn for too long, not a moment of deliberate choice at a crossroads. Just the slow, almost geological drift of a divine purpose across 2,000 years of incarnate life, until the purpose has the same general shape but inhabits a very different position in the landscape of the East. And here is what that means for the peoples of the East in the Third Age. When the armies of Sauron march west toward Gondor, when the Easterlings and Variags join the Shadow's forces, we are told in the text that these are peoples who have been under Sauron's domination for a long time, who serve him out of some combination of fear and fealty and cultural conditioning that goes back generations. Tolkien does not give us the interior life of those armies. He does not give us their priests or their rites or their history, but he does, in letter 211, tell us that the blue wizards may have had a lot to do with the way the world went. And in a letter to his son Christopher, he writes with a charity that is remarkable given the narrative role of the Easterlings in the story, that many of those soldiers were not evil in themselves, but deceived, or coerced, or raised inside a tradition of service to the Shadow that they had no framework to question. Now put those two things together. The blue wizards, sent to build resistance, may have built something that looked like resistance for a time, and then was absorbed into the broader ecology of the East's relationship with power and the divine. And the traditions they founded, the magical practices and cults that Tolkien says went astray, may have become part of the very cultural architecture that bound the peoples of the East to Sauron's cause in the Third Age. Not directly, not deliberately, but as the long consequence of a mission that began with heroic names and ended with Tolkien writing that he never had a clear story. That is the catastrophe that Gandalf's silence protects. Not a battle lost, not a ring surrendered. The possibility that the mission to counter Sauron's influence in the East may have, in its failure, actually deepened that influence by adding layers of mystical tradition and magical authority that Sauron could co-opt more effectively than the raw territories he had found there before the Blue Wizards arrived. Pay attention to this next part, because this is the lore layer that almost nobody connects. The Valaquenta in the Silmarillion describes the Vala who chose the Blue Wizards for the Eastern mission. Orome, whose name means hornblower. The Great Hunter, the Lord of Forests. The Vala who pursued Morgoth's creatures into the darkness of the world and did not flinch from what he found there. It was Orome who first discovered the elves in Cuiviénen, who rode into the shadow to find them and bring them to the light. It was Orome whose horn, the Valaroma, shook the mountains of Middle-earth and drove back the servants of Morgoth. And it was Orome, Tolkien tells us in Unfinished Tales, who chose LOTR as one of the Blue Wizards, whose particular nature and whose particular relationship with the darkness of the world made him suited for the Eastern Commission, which means the Blue Wizards were, at their choosing, an extension of Orome's nature. The hunter who goes into the dark, the horn that sounds in the shadow, not the counselor by the fire, not the keeper of fireworks and the stirrer of hobbit courage, but the one who walks into the worst territories without waiting for them to improve. And Orome, of all the Valar, would understand what that walk costs. He had done it himself. He had ridden into the shadow and been changed by what he found there, not corrupted but marked, carrying the weight of a world that does not release you cleanly once you have entered its deepest places. He chose the Blue Wizards for an Eastern commission that was, at its heart, an extension of his own defining act. Going where others would not, into the dark, with a name that says what you intend to do there. Darkness Slayer, East Helper, and then the silence. Which brings us to the real question, the question sitting underneath the question of whether Gandalf could remember. It is this: what did the Valar know? When they sent Morinitar and Romestamo east with those names and that commission, with the built-in limitation of mortal flesh and the designed forgetting of divine memory, did they know that the East was a territory in which those limitations might not be survivable? Did Orome, who had ridden those shadows himself, understand that what he was asking his chosen Maiar to do was something that even he, a full Vala in his native power, had found barely endurable? Tolkien writes in the Ainulindale that Ilúvatar foresaw everything, that the music contained all of history, that nothing occurred outside its themes, even when Morgoth believed he was introducing something new, which means the fate of the Blue Wizards, whatever it was not outside the plan. It was inside it. It was one of the themes. But foreknowledge is not the same as intention. Ilúvatar foreknowing that the Blue Wizards would go astray is not Ilúvatar wanting them to go astray. The music contains the fall of Númenor, but the Valar did not want Númenor to fall. The music contains Feanor's oath, but Manwë did not want the oath sworn. Foreknowledge in Tolkien's cosmology is a description of divine grief, not divine indifference. Which means the Valar sent Morinitar and Romestamo east with the clearest eyes they could offer, with the best names they could give, with a patron whose nature most closely matched the mission, and they watched them go. And the music said what would happen, and the music was right, and the Valar grieved it the way you grieve a thing you knew was coming and could not prevent without violating the freedom of the very people you are trying to serve. And Gandalf arrived 1,000 years later, wearing his own veil of flesh, carrying his own designed forgetting, walking west while the East held its silence. Picture this. It is the year 2063 of the Third Age. The watchful peace has begun. Sauron, driven out of Dol Guldur by Gandalf, has fled east, back toward the territories he has cultivated for millennia. And Gandalf, returning from that first confrontation with the necromancer, does not yet know what dwells in Dol Guldur. He suspects Sauron. He is not yet certain. He rides back toward the west, toward Rivendell, toward the councils that will slowly build the understanding that the necromancer is not a lesser evil, but the Lord of the Rings himself, returned in diminished form. And somewhere in the east, ahead of Sauron's retreating shadow, the thing that were once Morinitar and Romestamo continue their work. Whatever that work has become, whatever shape 2,000 years of incarnate life and the slow erosion of divine purpose have given it. Still alive, perhaps, because Tolkien in his later writings suggests they may have survived into the Fourth Age, still present, still speaking whatever languages the peoples of the East have shaped around the tradition of two old men who arrived in the Second Age with impossible names and a mission from the Lord of the Halls of Aman. Does Gandalf know they are there? Does he feel them, the way you might feel the presence of someone you knew in a life before memory? A presence that lives below the threshold of conscious recall, but shapes the texture of everything you do. Does the veil of flesh prevent even that? Or is the veil precisely calibrated? Not to erase them from his awareness, but to keep the awareness at a distance that allows him to function. To know that they went east, to know that they may have failed, to carry that knowledge the way you carry a stone in your boot, always present but not always thought about, always changing the way you walk without announcing itself as the reason you walk that way. Because this is the thing about Gandalf's mission that changes when you understand the Blue Wizard's context. He is not just the wizard who guided the Fellowship. He is not just the one who said you shall not pass and meant it. He is a Maya who walked his Western mission through an entire Third Age, knowing that the Eastern mission was happening, or had happened, or had failed, and that the failure, if it was a failure of exactly the kind of limitations built into his own body. The same designed forgetting that keeps him from accessing his full divine nature is what may have worn LOTR and Palando away from theirs. The same incarnate flesh that makes him useful as a kindler of hobbit courage is what made them vulnerable to 2,000 years of the East's slow absorption. He walks his mission carrying the proof of what his mission can cost. And he never says it directly. Here is what that means for every scene we have with Gandalf in Middle-earth. Every moment of his apparently effortless authority, every scene where he arrives exactly when needed and says exactly the right thing, in exactly the right tone, to produce exactly the right response in the person who needs to act. All of it is framed now by the knowledge that he is a figure who knows what it looks like when divine purpose in mortal flesh runs out. He is competent not in spite of that knowledge, but partly because of it. The urgency that drives him, the refusal to linger, the insistence that the quest matters, and the deadline is real, and the time for hesitation is not now. It is all shadowed by the understanding that delay is exactly how you drift. Saruman delayed. Saruman paused. Saruman spent his years in Orthanc thinking and studying and looking into the Palantir, conducting his research, building his understanding, and the delay was the corruption. Not a dramatic temptation, but the slow substitution of contemplating the ring for resisting it. The Blue Wizards may have done the same thing. Not through arrogance, but through the simple weight of time and the accumulated pressure of living inside a mission that had no clear victory condition, no ring to destroy, no mountain to climb to, just the endless patient work of stirring up resistance in territories that resisted being stirred, century after century, until stirring up resistance and being absorbed by the resistance became hard to distinguish. Gandalf moves. He is always moving. He does not settle in Orthanc. He does not build a tower. He walks the roads of Middle-earth from Shire to Gondor and back, constantly in motion, constantly engaged with the specific urgent needs of specific people who need specific things right now. And the habit of motion is not just personality. It is strategy. It is a Maya who understood, perhaps not consciously, but in the marrow of his incarnate wisdom, that the danger to an Istari is not the dramatic choice, but the slow one. Not the moment you take the ring, but the decade you spend deciding whether you are thinking about the ring in order to resist it or in order to possess it. Now here is where the argument hits its deepest layer. the one that I have been building towards since the beginning, the one that the cold opens question was always pointing at. Did Gandalf stay silent about the blue wizards because he truly could not remember, or because he remembered exactly, and chose mercy over truth? The question, heard again now, after everything we have built, should feel different than it did at the start. Because now we know what the mercy would actually be protecting. Not the blue wizards' reputation, not their historical legacy among men and hobbits who barely know their names. The mercy would be protecting the people Gandalf is trying to lead to courage. The hobbits, the men of Rohan, the people who are being asked to stand against a shadow so enormous that looking directly at it in its full historical extent would make standing against it feel not heroic, but simply impossible. Because here is what the full truth of the blue wizards tells you, if you let it tell you everything. It tells you that two Maiar, spirits of divine origin, chosen specifically for their suitability for the Eastern mission, equipped with names that were prophecy, and a patron who was the great hunter of the darkness, walked into the East during the Second Age, and did not return as what they were sent to be. It tells you that the mission to counter Sauron's influence in the Eastern territories, the mission that ran parallel to everything Gandalf was doing in the West across the entire Third Age, may have produced net harm. Not through evil intention, but through the sheer erosive power of time and incarnation, and the impossible weight of a mission with no clear ending. If Frodo Baggins, sitting in Bag End, with Gandalf's pipe smoke drifting over him, knew all of that, could he have walked out the door? Could he have left the Shire, crossed the misty mountains, entered Moria, gone to Rivendell, accepted the quest, if the full weight of what failure looks like in this world had been placed on him before he had taken a single step? Would there have been steps to take? Probably not. And Gandalf knows it. Because Gandalf has been walking his mission for 1,000 years with exactly that weight somewhere in the body of him, and the weight has not stopped him, but he is Maya. He is whatever diminished version of the divine remains inside the incarnate flesh. Frodo is a hobbit from the West Farthing, with furry feet, and a taste for mushrooms, and an inheritance from a mad uncle. The mercy is proportional, the silence is calibrated. You give people the truth they can carry. You hold the rest yourself. In that place below conscious memory, where the designed forgetting lives alongside whatever it has not fully erased. Picture this, the halls of Moria, after the bridge at Khazad-dûm. The Fellowship has climbed out of the darkness. Gandalf has not. And in the long months before he returns, before he is sent back as Gandalf the White with all the urgency that implies, there is a question that nobody in the Fellowship can answer. What happened to him between the bridge and the reappearance? He wrestled with the Balrog on the peak of Ziraxigil and was remade. But the remaking, the sending back, required something. Required a decision from somewhere above the world that this instrument was still needed, that the mission was not done, that the thing the Grey Pilgrim had been doing was incomplete in a way that demanded continuation. And the White Council that authorized that continuation knew, somewhere in its divine architecture, that the Eastern mission had not produced what they hoped, that the balance of the world, in the Third Age's final crisis, rested on the Western mission, completing what the Eastern one could not. That Gandalf had to come back, not only because the Fellowship needed him, but because the alternative, a world in which the Eastern mission's failure was unredeemed by anything in the West, was not the conclusion the music had written for the Third Age. He came back, as something greater, something less veiled, something whose urgency had been stripped of all the patience that might have slowed him. Gandalf the White does not smoke a pipe on a hillside and wait. He arrives at Edoras and wakes a king. He rides to Minas Tirith and holds a city. He does not have time for the slow work anymore, because the slow work in the East demonstrated what the slow work costs when it goes wrong. Now we reach the place in this argument where the lore stops being about Tolkien's world and starts being about something true. There is a kind of grief that comes from watching someone you love attempt something heroic and become, through no failure of character, through nothing more than the sheer duration of the attempt, something they would not have chosen to be. Not corrupted, not broken, just worn into a different shape by the specific gravity of what they were trying to do. 2,000 years is not a story. 2,000 years is a geology. And the Maiar who went east with the names Darkness Slayer and East Helper and came back, or did not come back, as something Tolkien could not describe clearly, did not fail because they were weak or evil or ambitious. They failed because they were divine in mortal flesh, and the mortal flesh ran out of whatever it is that keeps a divine purpose pure over geological time. Gandalf understood this, not consciously, not as a lesson he could recite, but in the way that a sailor understands a particular kind of current without being able to explain fluid dynamics, in the body, in the instinct, in the choices that look spontaneous, but are actually the product of a wisdom too old to be articulate about itself. And so he moved, and he urged others to move, and he kept the silence about the blue wizards, not because they were unimportant, but because they were the most important cautionary tale available to him, and cautionary tales are not what you tell someone who is already afraid. You tell cautionary tales to people who are safe. You tell courage to people who are frightened. And the whole of Tolkien's Third Age is a story about frightened people needing courage, not one more reason to be afraid. The silence was mercy. It was strategy. It was the specific wisdom of a Maiar who understood what carrying the full weight of the world's failures does to the people who are still trying to shape its future. Now, let us come to the question one final time. The same question, but heavier now, with everything we have built behind it. Did Gandalf stay silent about the blue wizards because he truly could not remember, or because he remembered exactly and chose mercy over truth? I do not think those are two different things. I think the mercy and the forgetting are the same mechanism, installed by the same hands, for the same purpose. The Valar who built forgetting into the Astray were not being cruel to their emissaries. They were being merciful to the world those emissaries were sent to save. Because a wizard who remembers everything, who carries the full divine weight of what LOTR and Palando became, who looks at every struggling mortal and sees not their courage, but the proof that courage in mortal flesh is subject to erosion, that wizard cannot do what Gandalf did, cannot sit across a fire from a young hobbit and believe, with the whole force of his being, that this particular young hobbit, in this particular moment, with this particular ring in his pocket, has the capacity to do something that will matter. The forgetting is the gift. The mercy is the silence, and the silence is not a wound. It is armor, placed on him by the same hands that placed the secret fire in Ilúvatar's keeping, the fire that makes things real and new, and capable of acts that the music did not predict, because the music did not need to predict them, because they were free. And here is the final thing, the one that makes the grief arrive properly, not as a sensation, but as an understanding. The blue wizards walked east, with names that meant Darkness Slayer and East Helper. They walked into the most dangerous territory of the Second Age, the territory where Sauron had been longest and worked hardest, and they walked into it with incarnate bodies and designed forgetting and the specific vocational genius that Orome saw in them and bet on. And they walked for 2,000 years, and something happened out there that Tolkien could not quite bring himself to name, that he circled around in letters and essays and never landed on directly. And the Third Age ended without a clear account of them. And the Fourth Age began with the traditions they may have founded still alive in the East, shape-shifted into something that might not have been what they intended. And nobody mourns them, because nobody knows them well enough to mourn them, because Gandalf kept the silence. Because the silence was the kindest thing he could offer, not just to the hobbits and the men and the elves who needed to believe that courage was still possible, but to the memory of two Maiar who went out with the best names available and came back different, or did not come back at all. Morinitar, Romestamo, Darkness Slayer, East Helper. They went, and the East received them, and the music knew what happened there. And Iluvatar grieved it, maybe, the way the music says Iluvatar grieves, foreknowing, unable to prevent without violating the freedom that makes the act matter, watching from a distance that is not distance, but something more like the inside of everything, present at every moment of the drift, without being able to reach in and correct it, without rewriting the very nature of free and incarnate life. And somewhere in Middle-earth, in the Third Age, Gandalf the Grey sits with a hobbit and a pipe and a question he will not answer directly, and the silence he keeps is not ignorance. It is the most precise thing he has ever said. It is the shape of a grief he was not fully built to carried anyway, because the alternative was to hand it to someone who had no framework to survive it. That is what Gandalf's silence about the blue wizards actually is. Not a plot gap. Not an authorial omission Tolkien never got around to filling. It is a mercy built into the architecture of the world, calibrated to the exact weight of what failed in the East, held inside a veil of mortal flesh for an entire age of the world, and never once broken, because breaking it would have required explaining to someone like Frodo Baggins that two Maiar, with heroic names and a divine commission, walked the road before him, and what the road made of them. And Frodo still had to walk it. So the silence held, and the ring went to the fire, and the names Morinitar and Romestamo survived only in the late pages of a posthumous essay and the private admission of a letter written in 1958, where Tolkien looked at the eastern edge of his own legendarium and said, quietly, that he never had a clear story. Not because the story was not there, but because some stories are held inside a silence that the world needed more than it needed the truth. If this conversation has unsettled something in how you understood Gandalf, if the Grey Pilgrim feels different to you now, not smaller, but somehow more weighted, carrying something you did not previously see him carry, that feeling is worth sitting with. It is the feeling of Tolkien's world read at full depth. Not the adventure, not the maps and the languages, and the beautiful names, but the architecture underneath them, the cosmological laws, and the divine griefs, and the long consequences of decisions made before the Third Age began. What I find myself returning to is the space between Tolkien's two names for the blue wizards, the names he invented first, Alatar and Palando, which are beautiful but opaque, and the names he settled on late, Morinitar and Romestamo, which are transparent as prophecy. The gap between those naming choices, across Tolkien's own writing life, mirrors the gap between what the blue wizards were intended to be and what they became. He began with names that told us nothing. He ended with names that told us everything, and still could not fill the silence between them with a story. Maybe that is the truest thing. Maybe the blue wizards are Tolkien's own unanswerable question, not about his world but about mission and purpose, and the thing that happens to a great intention when it meets the specific gravity of a world that has been suffering for longer than the intention has been alive. Maybe Tolkien could not write their story because he understood that some stories do not have a form that survives the telling, that the form of the blue wizard's story is silence. That Gandalf keeping the silence was the author keeping the silence, that the mercy and the forgetting belong equally to both of them. The central question of this video was, did Gandalf stay silent about the blue wizards because he truly could not remember, or because he remembered exactly and chose mercy over truth? Here is the answer I want to leave with you. Not a resolution, a weight. Maybe the question itself is the point. Maybe what Tolkien built into the legendarium, through the designed forgetting of the Astray and the long silence of the Eastern mission and the posthumous naming of Darkness Slayer and East Helper, is a meditation on the exact kind of knowledge that cannot be carried without damage and cannot be discarded without loss, and so is held in the specific silence of a figure who understands both the weight and the cost and chooses, every morning of every year of a 1,000-year mission, to carry it rather than pass it on. That is not ignorance. That is love. A very old, very tired, very incarnate love. wearing grey robes and smoking a pipe, and sitting across from a hobbit who does not need to know what happens to heroes when the mission is longer than heroism can sustain. If you have your own thoughts about where the Blue Wizards actually went, or what you think the traditions they founded might have looked like, or whether you believe Gandalf's silence was mercy, or something more complicated than mercy, I want to hear them. Not as an invitation to speculate without direction, but because the questions that Tolkien left open at the eastern edge of his world are the ones that reveal something true about what you believe Arda was ultimately for. And those conversations, the ones that begin in lore and end somewhere genuinely philosophical, are why this channel exists. Stay with us. There is more to find.